Hi YouTube, welcome to my Get Out of Gold series. I'm Nitisa and I hit Master in TFT this season. This is my lol chest here. This video is part one of my series where I'll be talking about game plan. But if you like this video, please consider subscribing because I'll be putting out additional videos trying to help you guys climb ranked. Okay, let's get started.
So today I'm going to be talking about your general game plan. I looked around and there's plenty of guides out there that cover things like meta comps, how to manage your econ, positioning guides, but what I wanted to talk about in this video is more about mindsets and general game plans that will help you improve your overall consistency regardless of what comps, items, or units you end up playing. So first of all, I wanted to establish a basic mentality that I feel like all players who want to climb ranked should have. TFT, and this goes for all card games with some RNG element, is about consistency over a large number of games. The more correct decisions you can make, the more consistently you will play, and the more you'll climb overall, even if sometimes those correct decisions don't pan out. One thing that I notice is a lot of players feel rewarded for wrong decisions when they work out, or feel discouraged even when they made the correct decision just because it didn't pan out in that particular game. So in today's video, I want to talk to you about general game plan mindsets that can help you to make more correct decisions overall based on the state of the game. The topics I'll be covering today are how to plan your comp, playing the units you find, tempo, and when to pivot and how. Okay, let's dive right in and talk about team comps. So when you jump into a game of TFT, you should always be planning ahead for the late game. When trying to decide what comp you're going to play, you should always look at the items you have first, what chosen you hit second, and what units you find third, in that order and priority. So let me explain. Of all the resources in TFT, items are the most restrictive. Even though you can try and choose an item on Carousel, it's never a guarantee. Someone might take the item first, or even if you sack for first pick, the item might not even be available on the Carousel. It's happened to me a few times. So as a general rule of thumb, remember that your items have the most impact on deciding what comps you can play because they are the most limited. Let me give you an example. Let's say we hit a chosen duelist Yasuo on round 1-3, but your opening items are, I don't know, let's say a rod, a belt, and a chain. At this point in the game, committing to a Yasuo reroll comp, I feel like would be incorrect because your items don't support that comp. That doesn't mean you can't pick up the free 2-star unit and play it as a strong early game pick, but to mentally lock yourself in at this point and say, duelist Yasuo or bust, I think is wrong. So how do you choose a comp around your items? Well, most games you start out with 3, sometimes 2 items to begin the game with. Generally speaking, you should be looking at your starting items and trying to make at least one strong but flexible early game item that will point you in a general direction for the late game. Let's say you start the game with a cloak, a bow, and some other item. From here, one strong path would be to make a Runin's Hurricane, because currently that is a strong early game item that has a lot of item carriers and pivots strongly into the late game. Some good options for units that can carry this item is Vayne in maybe a sharpshooter's comp, or Zed in maybe a ninja or cultist shade comp, or Warwick in like a divine or hunter comp. So with this one item, you've narrowed down the list of comps you're going to play, but it's still a pretty big list. So the idea is that you've committed to a strong but flexible item, knowing that you have options for the mid to late game. Okay, the next thing you want to consider is your chosen. Bear in mind, some comps require you to hit the chosen in order to play the comp. For example, like Duelist Yasuo or like Moonlight, so on and so forth. That doesn't mean it's not okay to play these comps in the early mid game without the chosen, but to force these comps into a late game comp without that chosen would generally be a mistake. Instead, you should generally think about choosing either a strong early game champion that you can use to help you snowball your early game, or a chosen that has a lot of synergy with the item that you made early on, or at least with the comp that you plan on going. Let's talk about some examples. Early on, let's say you find a Brawler Tom Kench. Now, obviously, Fortune Tom Kench is an insta-pick because early Fortune is broken. But Brawler Tom Kench, you can debate on taking it or not because it is still a beefy 2-star unit. If you have a good defensive item, you can run it as a solo frontline with backline, and it can potentially be a strong unit that helps you snowball your early game, which you pivot out of later on. Obviously, sometimes you find the perfect chosen and then it's smooth sailing from there. But in the situations where you don't hit your perfect chosen, oftentimes you need to consider taking other strong chosens just to maintain board presence until you find a chosen that better fits your comp, or you roll for a different chosen in the late game while you're pivoting. Once you have a chosen that works with your comp, or at least is playable in the meantime, the last thing you're going to want to pay attention to is the units that you're playing. You should always be aware of how your plan is going. So let's say you have a tentative plan to play sharpshooters with Vayne chosen. But the game keeps throwing divine units at you, and you're getting no sharpshooters. At some point, you need to be conscientious enough to know that you're not finding the core units to your original plan, but the core units to your plan B are sitting right in front of you. It's not wrong to hold some of those units in case you find more, as long as you're not overly impacting your econ, so that maybe at some point you can pivot if you're not finding the units that you need. Lastly, you should always think of your comp as flexible, as like a tree with multiple variations based on what you find, and maybe even multiple comps that build out of the comp that you're playing. In the early game, you should always carefully consider the units you find at every shop to look for combinations, pairs that could be potentially stronger than what you have. Let's say you're running 2 1-star brawlers on stage 1, but then find 2 2-star vanguards. It's probably better to trade out the 2 1-star brawlers that you have for the 2 vanguards just because they're generally stronger units and you're playing a stronger board at that point in time. This leads us into point 2, which is playing the units that you find. Just a few quick notes here. You always want to be paying attention to synergies and looking for pairs. Generally, you should be holding pairs and not more, because the level of investment that you get from going from a 2-star unit to a 3-star unit is extremely high, and you don't want to negatively impact your econ that hard unless that 3-star unit is going to dramatically change the game for you. Second thing you want to think about when you are looking for units early on is thinking about item holders. So let's say you slammed an early item on an item holder, but then a better item holder comes along. You're obviously going to want to pay attention and swap that out. But you're not going to think about that unless you're actively looking for better item holders. The third point I want to talk about today is tempo. Tempo is a big topic that I don't see a lot of other people discuss in guides, but it's really important. So think of tempo as the pace of the game. Like how quickly are people developing the strength of their board, whether by upgrading their units or leveling up. Tempo is a really important thing to think about because keeping up with the pace of the game, getting ahead or behind the curve, can often simply just lead to you winning or losing the game. So if you look around, you'll see plenty of leveling guides out there, like when to level, how much gold should you have, so on and so forth. But what often isn't talked about is why you need to level at these points in the game. Most of the time, the reason is that if you don't level, you will fall too far behind, either by not having enough units on the board or not having access to stronger units, and you just simply end up losing too much HP and the game. So it's important for you to be aware of key breakpoints in the game, which are usually right after creep or carousel rounds, where you need to be investing your gold to keep up with the pace of the game. One general rule of thumb that I use is that on every even XP round, if you can go to the next level and still stay above 30 gold, you should seriously consider leveling up. One exception is if you're trying to stay at a particular level to roll for a 3-star unit. However, if you don't hit your 3-star unit, you need to be aware that at that next tempo breakpoint, when everyone else is about to level up, if you aren't also increasing your board power with a 3-star unit, you're going to start seriously falling behind. So at that point, you may need to think about whether or not it's worth it to continue pursuing that 3-star unit. If that 3-star unit isn't game-changingly good, like maybe a Katarina 3 with good items, then maybe it's time to give up, cut your losses, and try to keep up with the tempo of the game by leveling up with your remaining gold. Otherwise, you run the risk of falling too far behind the curve, and even if you hit that 3-star unit, you're just too far behind. Everybody else has access to strong late game units who just beat your 3-star. So tempo is something that you should always be keeping in mind and planning your moves around. Okay, let's briefly touch on streaking too. One of the reasons why win streaking early is so good is because it allows you to push the tempo of your game. Lose streaking also allows you to grow your econ at a similar pace, but obviously comes at the cost of your HP, and I've found at lower elos it's a lot harder to do simply because you run into players who really don't know what they're doing, and to intentionally lose to them or consistently lose to the lowest player in the lobby can be tricky sometimes, and what you end up doing is just ruining your streak. So a lot of the times, if you find a strong board early, pushing your lead is extremely powerful. A lot of times I see players hesitate to commit strong early items or strong early boards because they're quote-unquote saving their items for perfect items for the late game, or they missed out on powerful synergies because they were tunneled in on a particular comp or chosen that they found. But let me give you a scenario. Let's say you start the game with a strong early game item that you make, and you find a decent early game item holder for it. You push your lead and you level up early. You push to level 4 on 2-1 before everybody else. Then you push to level 5 after the carousel round on 2-5. Then to level 6 on round 3-2, just after creep rounds and on the even round. At this point in the game, you've gained so much extra gold by pushing your lead and your win streak that it allows you to reach these higher levels and by extension more powerful late game units much earlier and before anyone else in the game, which means that you can continue to extend your lead, get first pick on all the later game units that you're rolling for, and by extension eventually reach level 8, 9 far before anyone else, and suddenly you can just do powerful things like fill your board with powerful legendary units, or maybe even roll for a chosen legendary before anyone else. And by the time the end of the game rolls around, you're still at like 70 HP while the next highest player is at 20 or 10. And the reason you were able to accomplish this is because you pushed the tempo of your game harder than anyone else in the lobby and ran away with your lead. So hopefully that gives you an idea of why tempo is so important and why you should keep it in mind when you're considering the pace of how you play and when you level up, so on and so forth. Okay, the last topic I want to talk about today is pivoting, and I get a lot of questions about pivoting. How to pivot, when to pivot, what should I pivot to, so on and so forth. So usually the biggest reason you pivot your board is because you've been playing early game units that have become outclassed by stronger late game units that are now available to you. And you want to change your board out to either better fit the late game comp you have in mind or to just generally power up your board. Sometimes that even means looking for a new chosen if you've been playing a maybe strong early game chosen that is now slowly becoming obsolete. So the key things that you want to keep in mind when you're pivoting your board is knowing when units become available. This is purely based on level, and so you need to know what level to roll at in order to reliably hit the units you want. I'm going to go ahead and put a chart of the star levels and when to roll for them on the screen, but this is also readily available information. You need to be familiar with this so that you can know when to roll. So because units become available based on your level, you need to know when it's better to either roll or to level. If the units that you want aren't available until the late game, you need to be playing other units and synergies until you can reach the level that you can reliably look for those late game units. So don't just roll for units without thinking about when is the best time to find them, and sometimes it's better to invest your money to level up first so that you can more reliably find the units that you want. Okay, the last thing you need to keep in mind when you pivot is knowing what units you want to replace and which units you want to replace them with. So let's say you have an extra trait in your comp that you've been running. I don't know, maybe a Vanguard pair or, a random 2-hunter pair, but that doesn't fit in your late game comp. When you reach the level you need to in order to roll for those late game units, keep in mind which units you're trading out and which units you're replacing them with, so that you can make a quick swap when you find those units. Typically speaking, you will pivot at particular tempo points in the game, because leveling at those tempo points is part of what makes those tempo swings powerful. When you hit a key level, say level 7, late game units like 4-star units suddenly become much more readily available to you, and it may be a key point where you want to roll down some amount of your gold to look for those powerful 4-star units that fit into your comp and pivot your board around what you find. Those are some instances where pivoting is either correct or important. Another thing that I didn't mention earlier is chosen odds, which are different, and I'll put that up on the screen as well. Knowing when to roll for particular star level chosens is also important, and generally speaking, if you are about to start rolling for particular units and you're planning on ditching your chosen, it is generally correct to sell your chosen right before you roll so that you have maximum odds of finding a chosen that fits your comp. The last thing I want to say is that sometimes you don't hit what you're looking for, and that's just part of the game, unfortunately. But it's important to keep your mind open for alternative possibilities and suitable replacements so that you can maximize your odds for creating a working comp. You also need to know how much money you can roll based on the state of the game. If you're healthy, then you can probably be a little bit more greedy with your econ and slow roll. If you don't hit the units you need right away, it's okay if you lose a round or two because you have HP to spare. But on the alternative, if you're low HP, then you may need to think about all-inning and looking hard for the unit that will make the most difference to your board, whether that be hitting a particular 4-star, upgrading a particular 4-star or 5-star, so on and so forth. Okay, that's all I have for you guys today. Hopefully the concepts that I talked about today were helpful and help you to develop a better game plan for the way that you approach each game in a flexible manner, and hopefully help you to make more consistent decisions overall throughout the game and rank up your gameplay.